They called it his walking scrap iron, and they set it to his face on the loading dock at the Marl Hill elevator the morning he came in for a load of seed, the whole line of men grinning while Orval Deetz asked, loud enough for the scale office, whether Merritt Vance had finally decided to sell all 40 of the horned things for beef and buy himself a tractor like a man who meant to still be. Farming come 1960. The doc laughed. Merritt signed his ticket and said he believed he would keep the oxen a while longer, and he carried his seed out to the wagon with his back straight and his ears burning, and behind him the laughter had that particular Ring Valley men keep for a widower who will not take good advice. He was 52 years old that spring, the spring of 1948, and he had been a widower for 6 of those years, and he farmed a heavy black-gumbo bottom down in the Slewfoot Bottoms under Marl Hill, where the river had laid down the richest and the stickiest ground in the county, and the good families up on the high-level land had always privately agreed that a man farming the bottoms with beasts instead of a machine was a man farming in the last century. Elsie Vance had died of a low fever the winter of the deep snow, quiet in her sleep, and after the funeral the valley had been kind to Merritt in the way people are kind about a place they are quietly certain will fall behind the times inside 2 years. They brought hot dishes. They mentioned, gently, that the implement dealer in town would carry a man on easy terms, and that there was no shame in getting up to date. Merritt thanked them for the food, and he did not buy a tractor, and within a year he had done the thing that turned the valley's pity into open ridicule. He had raised and broke off his father's old stock and his own patient hand. A full working drove of 40 oxen, 20 yoke of them, more draft power and horned cattle than the whole rest of the valley put together still owned. The oxen had a reputation, and the reputation was that they were the past on 4 legs. Everyone in the Slewfoot country knew what an ox was and what an ox was good for, which was to say almost nothing a modern farmer respected anymore. They were big, slow, horned, patient animals that ate, Lord, how they ate, a whole bottom's worth of hay and fodder through a winter to move a plow come spring, and they were slow past, all bearing, walking the field at 2 miles an hour where a tractor crossed it at 10, so that a man behind oxen spent a whole long day at the head of a team doing what a machine finished before dinner and then sat idle. They needed breaking, which took a man years and a patience most men no longer had. They could not be parked in a shed and forgotten through the winter. They had to be fed and watered and doctored every day of the year, whether they worked or not. And worst of all, past every other fault, they were slow, that maddening, unhurriable, deliberate ox slowness that the whole up-to-date valley had gladly traded away the day the first tractor came down the road. The men on the elevator dock agreed that if a person had set out on purpose to farm in the most backward, hay-wasting, day-eating way a bottom man could, he could not have improved on a drove of oxen, and that only a man gone strange with grief and stubbornness would keep 40 of the horned things when the implement dealer would put him on a shiny machine for a signature. Merritt Vance was not, by the reckoning of the men on the loading dock, the sort of person anyone expected to know better. He was a spare, weathered man with sunlines at his eyes, and graying dark hair he kept under a sweat-stained wide felt hat, quiet by nature and quieter since Elsie died, and he had never in his life been one to argue a point in front of a scale office full of men. He kept to his bottom. He did his own breaking and his own doctoring, and put up his own hay and mended his own harness of an evening. And he remembered his father's ways, the old teamster's knowledge, the plain, hard lessons the river bottom had taught the Vances for 3 generations, and he trusted a thing he had watched with his own eyes over a thing a dock full of men agreed was true. That habit was about to make him the most laughed-at man in the valley. And then, though not one of the men grinning on the dock that morning would have believed it, the one they all came to. What none of them troubled to ask was why. Not one man on that dock, in all the weeks of easy laughter, ever thought to ask Merritt Vance why a careful man who counted every bushel and would not waste a nail would go out of his way to keep and feed 40 animals that everyone knew ate a fortune in hay and moved a plow at a crawl and brought nothing but beef price at the end. They did not ask because they were certain they already knew the answer, and the answer was that grief and stubbornness had made him backward. But Merritt had a reason, and the reason was a thing he had watched happen his whole life, on that very ground with his own 2 eyes. It had been his father who first said it in him years back. Standing at the edge of a bottom field, gone to black soup in a wet spring, when Merritt was a boy. His father had farmed that gumbo with oxen his whole life, as his father had before him, and he had told the boy, in the flat, certain way of a man passing on something his own people had learned the hard way, that a man could love a machine all he liked, but he had better understand the ground under it, because the Slewfoot Bottom was river gumbo, and river gumbo did not dry off on any schedule but its own, and that there would come wet springs not every year, but often enough to ruin a man who forgot them, when the bottom stood so saturated that nothing on a wheel could get on it without cutting down and miring to the axle, and that in a spring like that, the only thing that would put a crop in the ground was a beast that spread its weight on a split hoof and pulled slow and steady and did not sink. A wheel packs and cuts and bogs, his father said. An ox walks. Merritt had heard it as a boy and half forgotten it as a young man when the tractors came and everyone he knew went to them. And then he had watched it prove out, wet spring after wet spring, on his own bottom, until the watching left him no room to doubt. He remembered the way his father had said it, because he had not said it the way a man argues a thing. He had said it the way a man tells you the plain shape of the ground and does not much care whether you believe him. They had been standing at the turn row in the rain with the bottom shining black and impassable in front of them. And young Merritt had asked why the neighbors up on the level ground were already on their fields with the new machines, and they were not. And his father had said that the level ground was not gumbo and would dry, and the bottom was gumbo and would not this year, and that a man who farmed the bottom and forgot what the bottom was would one spring find himself sitting on the turn row with a Mired machine watching his planting season burn down to nothing. There had been no heat in it. It was the certainty of a man who has watched a thing be true so long that other men's fashions have stopped being interesting. And when his father passed and left him the bottom and the drove, the knottage stayed, and the wet springs proved it out one after another. And Merritt never forgot the flat sure sound of a man passing on a thing worth more than any machine on any dealer's lot. So it was not, whatever the valley believed, a thing Merritt had settled on out of grief or poverty. It was a thing he had inherited twice over, once from his father's mouth at the edge of a flooded field, and once from watching the bottom mire a wheel and pass a hoof every wet spring of his farming life. He had tested it the way he tested everything, not by arguing it, but by watching it, year on year, until the watching left no room for doubt on his own black bottom, the ground the valley thought a machine could master. There came springs when a tractor could not get off the turn row and an ox walked the field all day. His father had farmed 40 oxen on that ground. He had 40 now, 20 yoke, broke and matched and worked to the bow and the goad over patient years. He did not need a dealer or a level ground man or a single word of anyone's blessing to know what 40 broke oxen would do in a wet spring. And he did not much care that the valley thought him a fool for knowing it, because he had learned long since that being thought backward by people who have chosen to forget the ground under their machines is a cheap enough price for being able to plant when they cannot. The valley found out because valleys always find out, and the valley laughed. Word went round the elevator and the church steps and the implement lot within a season that the Vance widower had gone and kept his whole horn drove, 40 of them now broke and yoked, when every family with any sense had a tractor coming, and the country settled in to enjoy it. They could see him from the level road, they said, walking the head of a team at a crawl down in the bottom, while a man could have crossed the same field 10 times on rubber. And they marveled that a grown man would farm that way on purpose in this day and age. Orval Deetz, who had the newest and biggest tractor in the county, on the implement man's note and ran the country's opinions besides, allowed to the whole loading dock that he'd told Vance twice to get up to date and been ignored, and that now the man had a bottom full of walking scrap iron eating him out of house and home to drag a plow slower than a plow was ever meant to go, and that he supposed a person got the outfit they deserved. The men laughed. Not one of them asked the only question that mattered, which was what a man who had watched that gumbo bog a wheel and pass a hoof his whole life might know that a dock full of men riding brand-new tractors on the dealer's easy terms did not. The mockery had a face, and the face was the loading dock, and Merritt met it the only way he knew, which was to come in for what he needed and go out again without giving them the satisfaction of an argument. He heard it stop when he stepped up on the scale and start again lower, the way talk does when its subject walks in. One of the up-to-date men turned on the dock that first season and asked him for the pleasure of the room, whether he yoked his oxen for the plowing or just to have something to talk to, since he wouldn't buy a tractor to keep him company, because he couldn't rightly tell which they were for. The room laughed. Merritt said he kept them for the plowing, and left it there, and signed for his seed, and went out, and behind him the laughter had a slightly puzzled edge under it that it had not had going in, because a man who will not defend a backward thing is harder to laugh at than a man who will. He had learned in 6 years of being a widower the valley expected to fall behind that there is a particular loneliness in being the only one on a place who understands the ground it sits on. He did not enjoy it. He had simply stopped expecting company in it. The years of the keeping stayed with him. In the plain way patient work stays with a man who has done a great deal of it alone. A drove of oxen is not a thing a man buys. It is a thing he makes, yoke by yoke, over years. And Merritt made his the way his father had taught him. He matched his steers young for size and stride and temper. The near ox and the off ox of a yoke fitted to pull, even so neither carried the other, and he broke them slow to the bow and the goad and his own voice, gee and haw and the long steady whoa, until 40 animals knew their names and their sides, and would lean into a load together at a click of his tongue. He shod the ones that needed it, doctored the sore necks and split claws, mended the bows and yokes and log chains through the long winters, and fed the whole horned lot every day of the year, working or idle, out of hay he put up with their own labor. By the spring of 1948, the drove stood at 40 head, 20 yoke of big matched oxen that knew his goad and his voice, and knew the bottom ground the way a man knows his own hands, and stood ready in the lot for a planting season the whole valley thought they had no business being part of. There was a craft to working a drove that big on ground, that heavy, and Merritt had it now, a lifetime deep. An ox is only slow if a man measures him against a machine. Measured against the mud, he is exactly as fast as the ground allows, and no slower, which in a wet bottom is faster than anything on a wheel, because a wheel that is bogged has a speed of 0 and stays there. Merritt worked his teams in the cool of the day and rested them in the heat, and read each ox the way another man reads a gauge, the set of the ears, the lean of the shoulder, the first hint of a sore neck, and he never hurried them, because a hurried ox is a balked ox, and a balked ox in the mud is a man's whole day lost. He walked at their head with the goad on his shoulder and his voice low and even, and the drove leaned into the bows, and the log chains came tight, and the plow came through the black-gumbo slow and sure, at a pace the valley mocked, and the mud could not stop. He counted them every night, standing at the lot gate in the last of the light, while the teams came in off the bottom. Counting the big horned shapes through the bars, a habit that would matter more than he knew before the spring was out, because a man who counts his drove every night is a man who knows to the head that he has more pulling power standing in his lot than the whole valley has sitting on the implement dealer's paper. He watched the sky that spring, too, the way some men watch a market. He would stand at the turn row of an evening with the day's damp going out of the ground and read the weather off the hill and the river, and he could feel, if you knew the bottom to feel it, the way the year was setting up, the ground already soft when it should have been firming, the ditches running full when they should have been falling, the cold gray rain coming again and again out of the west when the valley wanted sun to dry its fields for the tractors. And he knew a thing the up-to-date men did not, that the bottom was filling like a sponge with nowhere to shed the water, and that a bottom that saturated in March would not be fit for a wheel in May. No matter how the almanac read or how badly a man on a note needed to be planting, he did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell who would have heard it. But he saw it, and he filed it away with a lifetime of the same, and he went on feeding and matching and readying his drove while the valley greased its machines and waited, though none of them knew they were waiting, for the wet that was already standing in the ground. There was a neighbor's bottom field he watched that spring without meaning to, a low corner of the Deetz level place that dipped down onto the same gumbo as his own along the section ditch. And it taught him more than any almanac could about the difference his drove made. The Deetz corner and his own bottom lay on the same black river ground under the same cold gray sky, and there the sameness ended. Where his oxen worked, the field lay opened and planted, black furrows drying at the crown between the reins across the ditch, where the newest tractor in the county had tried the same ground and cut down to the frame. The corner stood scarred with 2 deep mired ruts and a churned wallow where a machine had spun itself under and been dragged out with a chain, his ground planted and standing to a crop, theirs torn and idle and waiting, and not a soul in the valley but him to read what the ditch line was plainly saying. He thought once of walking over and telling Orval Deetz what the bottom was going to do. He did not, because he knew how it would land, a widower with a lot full of oxen come to lecture the most up-to-date man in the county on his own ground, and he had long since made his peace with the plain hard fact that a thing seen is not a thing that can be given to a man who has decided not to look. For he had come, over the years, to hear the slowness the way the rest of the valley never could. To Orval Deetz and the men on the loading dock, the ox pace was simply the worst thing about a backward animal, a crawling waste of daylight fit only for a man who could not move with the times. But Merritt had learned to read it. He knew that the slow, even creak of bow and yoke and a sucking tread of 40 hooves coming steady through the mud meant the work was getting done on ground where nothing else could get it done at all. He knew that the pace that looked like idleness from the level road was the one pace that never balked and never bogged and never ran dry. That would still be crossing the bottom at a walk when every faster thing in the valley sat stalled. The slowness the whole country mocked him for was, to his ear, at once a work song and a promise, the plain, steady proof that his 40 tireless oxen would go on moving through anything the spring could throw at the ground. He had stopped hearing it as slowness a long time ago. He heard it as power that did not stop and as a crop in the ground come the wet. And by the end of that terrible spring, so would they. The land answered the way heavy ground answers a wet year. Through the early spring of 1948, the rain came on and would not quit, week after week of cold gray weather off the west, with the sun never long enough on the fields to firm them, and down in every bottom and every low corner of the level ground the water stood, and the gumbo went to black soup. It stood everywhere a wet spring builds it up. In the bottoms and the ditch corners and the flats that never quite drain, deep and saturated and shining, the way a ruinous planting season always begins as only a wet spell. The valley saw the rain and thought little of it at first. There was always rain in the spring. A man greased his tractor and cursed the weather and waited for a dry week to get on the ground, the way people do about a thing that has always come right before and never yet ruined them. That was the spring the valley learned different. On Merritt Vance's bottom, that same wet spring, the ground stood just as saturated and was being worked anyway, day after day while it drank. Where 40 oxen leaned into the bows from the cool of the morning to the fall of the light. The mud that stopped a wheel could not stop a hoof. The split claws spread and gripped where a tire spun, the slow, steady pull came on, where a spinning machine only dug itself under, and Merritt's bottom alone in all that country went into the wet spring with a crop going in the ground on time. He could walk his black furrows in the April rain and find them opened and planted and drying at the crown, could stand at his turn row of an evening and watch a team come in muddy to the belly off ground it had just planted, while every tractor in the valley sat clean and dry and useless on the turn row, and he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had watched it a lifetime, that his ground was being farmed while the country around him could not get a wheel off the headland, and the rest of the valley that same spring was learning the other half of it. Up on the high level ground and along the section roads and through all the wide up-to-date reach of the good machine-farmed places, the tractors sat, and then, worse than the mud, came the word off the rail line. There had been a long strike on the railroad that spring, and a pinch on fuel behind it, and the tank cars that fed the implement dealers' pumps stopped coming, so that the county's gasoline ran short and then ran out, and the dealer put a paper on his door that said no fuel till the cars ran again. By the middle of planting the valley, faced a thing it had not faced in 30 years, a bottom too wet for a wheel and a fuel tank too dry to run one where the ground would have held, and every up-to-date machine in the county sitting idle for the want of either dry ground or a drink of gasoline. The men greased engines that had nothing to burn and watched the calendar burn down toward the end of planting, and told each other it would surely dry and the fuel would surely come, and it did neither. The machines were only stopped. Everyone knew a machine sometimes stopped. And then a man remembered, standing on the dry loading dock with a strike on the rail and mud to the horizon, that there was one outfit in the whole valley that neither mired nor ran on gasoline, and the remembering was the beginning of the turn. The fear changed the way the valley moved. Men who had ridden the newest machines were out in the mud now, with teams borrowed from wherever a team could still be found, and hauling seed by hand up the mired roads. And standing in their doorways doing the sums no farmer wants to do, of a planting season half gone, and a crop not in the ground, and a note at the bank that did not care whether it had rained. They watched the last dry days for planting slip past and could not use them, because you cannot plant a bottom off a stalled tractor. And the talk on the loading dock that had been so easy all through the dry years went out of the men entirely, because there is no laughing left in a country where the ground is a soup and the fuel is gone and the seed is still in the sack. The valley had spent an up-to-date decade certain it knew what was worth keeping and what was scrap. It was learning, in the worst way there is, that it had had the whole thing backward. The county sent out a man from the farm office, and the farm man stood on the wet loading dock and told a knot of stalled farmers what by then they had already begun, with a dawning dread to understand that the bottoms would not be fit to plant for weeks yet the way the rain was standing, that the fuel would not come till the rail ran again, and that a man who could not get a crop in the next little while was going to be short a year's income he could not afford. A man in the crowd asked him, in the flat, worried voice of a man who already fears the answer, whether there was anything in that whole valley that could actually put a crop in the bottom ground now, wet as it was and dry as the pumps were. And the farm man spread his hands and said that short of stock that could pull on mud and needed no gasoline, he did not know of a thing that could get on that ground and work it. There was no such outfit left in the county, he said, that he knew of. No such outfit, that is, but one, though the farm man did not know it, and it would fall to an old hired hand standing on the dock to say so. It was Orval Deetz's own old hired man, a leathery fellow named Cleon Batts, who had teamed stock in the Bottoms 40 years before the tractors came and forgotten more about mud than most men ever learn, who said it first, and he said it standing on the wet loading dock with his hat pushed back and the rain dripping off the eave. He said he'd been down the bottom road that morning trying to get seed through, and that the whole valley was bogged to the frame as far as a man could see, every low field a soup and every tractor sitting where it had stuck, every one, he said, but Merritt Vance's ground. He'd come up on the Vance bottom, he said, and it was like coming up on a working farm in a country of stalled machines. The same rain had fallen on it, and the same mud stood in it, and down in it 40 oxen were leaning into the bows and dragging a planter through the gumbo slow and steady as you please, and Vance's crop was going in the ground on time while the rest of the valley watched its planting season drown. The men around him went quiet, and Cleon Batts, who was too old and too tired to care much for loading dock laughter, said the thing none of the rest of them had let themselves think yet. He said, "It's them oxen. It's them slow-horned oxen of his we all laughed at. They don't bog, and they don't drink gasoline, and his is the only crop going in the ground in this whole valley. And every one of us called him 40 years behind the times for keeping them. No one laughed then. There is a particular silence that falls on a crowd of proud, up-to-date men when they understand, all at once, that the person they have been mocking was right, and it fell on that wet loading dock, and it did not lift. They stood there in the drip off the eave with their mired machines and their dry tanks and their seed still in the sack, and they understood that Merritt Vance, whom they had counted a backward fool, had spent the whole laughing decade keeping the one kind of power that would carry through a spring like this one, and that not a man among them had troubled once to ask him why. Some of them, standing there, would have been remembering their own words, the horned mess, the walking scrap iron, the machine a man of sense would buy, and finding those words going suddenly bitter in the mouth. It is one thing to be wrong. It is another to have laughed at the one who was right while your own planting season drowned in the field. And there is no man harder on a proud man in that moment than himself. They stood in the long silence, and they did the sum of it, every one of them, and not a word was said that a person would want to remember. Orval Deetz said nothing at all. He stood a while at the edge of the wet dock with his jaw working, a big, up-to-date man who had run the valley's opinions for a decade and had just heard his own hired hand name him, in front of everyone, the loudest of the fools. Then he got in his mired truck and worked it as far as the road would carry him, and where he went, though it cost him more than he could have said to do it, was down off his stalled level ground to the bottom end of the valley, to the black Slewfoot ground where the ox goad rose and fell in the rain, to the lot of the man he had told twice to get up to date and mocked a dozen times, to ask him, hat in his hands, for help. Merritt was at the lot when Deetz's truck came slewing up the muddy lane, and he heard the drove tell him a stranger was coming before he saw it, the low, uneasy shift and bawl of the oxen at the bars as they always gave for a truck they did not know, and he stood and waited by the gate with the goad still in his hand. Orval Deetz got out slow. He was a big man and a proud one, and he did not have the first idea how to do what he had come to do, and he stood at the lot fence a long moment looking out over the black-planted bottom and the muddy, contented drove and the crop already standing where his own ground lay torn and idle, at a thing no other man in the valley had to look at any more, and at last he took off his hat, which the valley had never once seen Orval Deetz do at another man's fence, and he said he reckoned Vance had seen what the rain had done. Merritt said he had. Deetz said Cleon allowed his was the only crop in the ground in the whole valley. Merritt said it was, the oxen had planted it on time. And Orval Deetz looked at his hat in his hands, and he said, in a voice gone low and rough, that he'd been wrong about the oxen, and that he was sorry for the way he'd talked, and that he was stalled out with his seed in the sack and his tank dry and a note at the bank, and could he, bring a team or two up onto the level bottom and help a beaten man get his crop in the ground before the season was gone for good. He did not gloat. That was the thing the valley would remember about Merritt Vance long after the big muddy spring had passed into an old story told on the loading dock, that when the turning came, and it came all the way, he took not 1 ounce of pleasure in it. He had every right in the world to stand at that gate and let Orval Deetz feel the full weight of every word he had ever said on that dock, and he did not. He looked at the big up-to-date man turning his hat in his hands, and he thought, if he thought anything, of a crop not in the ground, and a note that did not care, And he said only that a man could not learn oxen in a week, and it was late in the season, but that he'd bring 2 of his best yoke up come morning and open Deetz's bottom himself and put the crop in for him, and that they'd talk about a broke yoke of his own for the man to keep against the next wet spring once the seed was safe in the ground. He named him a fair price for the help and for the yoke, the same he'd have named anyone, and not a dollar of grudge in it. And Orval Deetz, who had told the whole loading dock to sell that horned mess for beef, stood at the widower's gate and thanked him, and meant it, and drove home to wait for a team of the oxen he had mocked to come up in the morning and save his year. He was the first, and then they came. The widow Pruitt came, whose husband had died in the winter and whose garden bottom stood too wet to spade, and Merritt brought a single ox down and plowed her patch in an afternoon and would not take a dollar for it. Not from a widow with a wet garden and a lean year coming. The families off the section road came, stalled and dry-tanked. The old hand Cleon Batts came on his own account, embarrassed and grinning, and said he'd wanted a yoke of his own for 30 years and been too proud to keep one after the tractors came, and Merritt gave him first call on a young pair and told him he was a fool for waiting. And it was the closest thing to a joke the valley ever heard him make. Through the rest of that wet spring the muddy trucks came slewing down the bottom road to the black end of the valley one after another, to the lot of the man they had laughed at, to hire his teams and buy his broke steers and beg his patient help getting a crop in ground no wheel could cross, and to look, most of them, at the one planted bottom in the valley and understand at last what they had been laughing at. He hired out what teams he could spare and sold the broke yoke a man was ready for and gave his labor free where it needed giving. And he showed every one of them, patient and plain, how a man handled stock that pulled on mud and ran on hay, and told them to start a boy on the goad young if they wanted a teamster made. He had been the most laughed at man in the valley in March. By the time the ground dried, he was the reason half of them had a crop in it at all. The danger passed, the way these things pass, when the weather finally broke into a dry, warm spell, and the rail cars ran again, and the fuel came, and the bottoms firmed at last under a late sun. The valley counted its losses and found them heavy, a short crop on the level places that got in late, a corner or two left unplanted for the year. More than one family carried only by the bank's patience and a neighbor's borrowed team. It could have finished some of them, and everyone knew, without much wanting to say it, the one bottom in the valley that had gone in on time, and why. And in the years that followed, a strange and quiet thing settled over the Slewfoot country. It became, of all the unlikely things, a place that kept its oxen. The slow creak of bow and yoke that had once carried up the bottom as a backward man's folly now rose from more than one lot of a wet spring, and the up-to-date men who had sold their draft stock for a signature kept a broke yoke in the shed now against the year the ground went to soup and the tank ran dry, and no one laughed at it any more. They had learned the hard way to see it the way Merritt always had, not as 40 years behind the times, but as power that did not bog and did not run dry, and as a crop in the ground the year the machines could not move. Merritt Vance never once threw it back at them, and that, in the end, was what made the valley take him in the way it had never taken a widower alone before. He could have. He had stood on that dock and taken their laughter for 6 long years, and when the turning came, he could have collected on every word of it, and he never did. He hired Orval Deetz as team's fare and plowed the widow Pruitt's garden for nothing, and taught anyone who asked, and he never said, not once, that he had told them so, because he had not told them so. He had simply known and worked, and let the rain and the mud and the dry pumps say it for him. When a young man new to the bottom asked him, a year on, why he'd kept those oxen when the whole valley had gone to tractors and laughed, he only said that he'd watched that gumbo mire a wheel and pass a hoof every wet spring of his life, and that a thing you have seen with your own eyes is worth more than a dock full of men who are sure. And then he went back to his harness, because the dry spell had saved the year, but the bottom would go to soup again some other wet spring, and the drove still had to be fed and matched and counted in every night, and a man who has been proven right does not get to skip the evening's work any more than a man who has been laughed at does. They had said his oxen were scrap iron in the wet spring of 1948, and in a way they were right, slow at the plow, dear to feed, worth only beef price at the end, backward past anything a modern farmer wrote in his book. What Merritt Vance had understood, that none of them had troubled to ask, was that the worth of an ox was never in his speed at all. It was in the pull and the patience and the plain fact of 40 tireless beasts that would go on moving through mud and a dry fuel tank alike, putting a crop in the ground the one spring when everything faster in the valley sat stalled. A worth that did not show against a stopwatch and could not be laughed at once you had seen what its absence cost. The slowest, most old-fashioned, most out-of-date power on his whole place had turned out to be the only power that could move at all when the ground went to mud, and he had known it all along, and he had never needed them to know it, only to get their crops in beside his own. As his father had told him years before, at the edge of a flooded bottom in the rain, a wheel packs in cuts and bogs, an ox walks. Sometimes the slowest thing on the place is the only thing that will still be moving the day the ground turns against you. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that what they have isn't worth keeping. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, ask yourself this: how many of the slow, old, out-of-date things we are all so quick to be rid of are the very things that will still be moving when everything faster has stopped?